The pastor had barely finished his words when my father stood up in the third pew and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "I object." His voice bounced off the chapel walls and landed on me like a stone. I was standing at the altar in my white dress, holding my bouquet so tightly my knuckles had gone pale. My mother rose beside him, her face carved from ice. My father pointed at Daniel and called him a disgrace to our family name. Then he turned to the guests and demanded that every Whittaker in that room stand up and walk out. And they did. One by one, my aunts, uncles, and cousins stood. They didn't look at me. They didn't say a word. My sister Fiona was the last to go. She walked past me without a single glance, her heels clicking against the stone floor until the door swung shut behind her. Half the chapel was empty. Daniel reached for my hand. His fingers wrapped around mine, warm and steady. The pastor cleared his throat and asked if we wanted to continue. I looked at the man I had chosen. Then I looked at the door my family had walked through. My eyes burned, but I did not cry. "Yes," I said. "We continue. My name is Naomi Whittaker." That was the day my parents disowned me for marrying the man I loved. Growing up, I believed my parents loved me. I had no reason to think otherwise. There was always food on the table, good schools, nice clothes, and family vacations to places my classmates had only seen in magazines. My parents told people they were proud of me, and I believed that too. But their love was a cage with a pretty door. Every decision in my life had been made for me before I even knew I had a choice. My mother picked my clothes every morning until I was 15. My father chose which university I would attend and which subjects I would study. They selected my friends carefully, steering me away from anyone they considered beneath the Whittaker name. I was never asked what I wanted. I was told what was right for the family. If I pushed back, even gently, my father would grow quiet in a way that made the whole house feel smaller. My mother would say things like, "After everything we have done for you, Naomi." That sentence alone was enough to silence me for weeks. I learned early that their love came with terms and conditions. As long as I followed the plan they had written for my life, everything was fine. The moment I stepped off that path, I found out exactly what their love was really worth. I met Daniel at a mutual friend's birthday dinner 3 years before the wedding. He was sitting at the far end of the table, laughing at something someone had said, and there was something easy and genuine about him that made me look twice. He worked in construction at the time, managing repair jobs for homeowners across the city. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't have a family name that opened doors or a father who played golf with businessmen. But he was honest, kind, and he listened to me like what I said actually mattered. I had never felt that before. When I brought him home the first time, my parents were polite in the way that people are when they have already decided to hate someone. My mother complimented his shoes and said nothing else to him all evening. My father asked about his family background once, heard the answer, and turned the conversation elsewhere. After Daniel left, my father sat me down. "He is not the kind of man this family is associated with," he said, as if Daniel were a cheap piece of furniture rather than a human being. The more they attacked him, the more I paid attention. Because what I saw in Daniel was everything my parents pretended to be. Decent, hardworking, and real. 3 months before the wedding, my father called me into his study. The room smelled like old books and leather, and he sat behind his desk the way he always did when he was about to say something that wasn't up for discussion. My mother sat in the chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap. My father looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "If you marry that man, do not ever call us again." The words hit me like a door slamming shut. My mother didn't flinch. She just looked at the floor, which told me she already knew what he was going to say and had agreed to every word. He told me I had one final opportunity. I could end things with Daniel, come back to the family plan, and everything would go back to normal. Or I could make what he called the worst mistake of your life, and lose them forever. I sat in that chair and cried. Not because I was choosing Daniel over my family. I cried because I realized I was being forced to choose it all. I drove to Daniel's apartment that night and told him everything. He held my hand and said we would figure it out together. I chose the man who had never once tried to control me. I believed, even up to the morning after the wedding, that my parents would come around. I told myself that the anger would cool, that they would miss me, and that someday we would find our way back to each other. I was wrong. The day after the wedding I tried to check my bank account and found it frozen. I called the bank in a panic and was told my father had removed me from the account. Called his phone. No answer. Called my mother. Straight to voicemail. That afternoon, a padded envelope arrived at Daniel's door addressed in my mother's handwriting. Inside were every photograph I had ever given her. My school graduation picture. The photo from my 18th birthday. A small framed snapshot from a family trip we had taken when I was 12. She had returned them all. That evening I tried calling my sister Fiona. The call didn't ring. She had already blocked my number. Within 24 hours, I had gone from daughter to stranger. The family trust my grandfather had left money in had been adjusted. My name had been removed. The financial safety net I had grown up assuming would always be there was simply gone. I sat on the floor of Daniel's apartment and understood, finally and completely, that they had meant every word. Daniel found us an apartment above a laundromat on the east side of the city. It had 2 small rooms, a window that wouldn't close properly, and walls thin enough that we could hear the machines running below us at all hours of the night. It was all we could afford. I had never lived without comfort before. I had grown up in a 4-bedroom house with a garden and a housekeeper who came on Thursdays. Now I was counting how many packets of pasta we had left and deciding whether we could afford to replace the broken light in the bathroom. Every night for weeks, I cried after Daniel fell asleep. Not because of the apartment. Not because of the cold or the noise or the tight budget. I cried because I kept wondering if my parents had been right. If I had been foolish and reckless and blind. My father had power, money, and connections. He knew how to make people feel small and he was very good at it. The silence from my family felt like a punishment carefully designed to break me. But Daniel would wake up every morning and make coffee and say, "We are going to be fine, Naomi." He said it so steadily that some mornings I almost believed it. I held on to almost. My parents didn't just cut me off. That would have been painful enough. Instead, they made sure the story spread before I had any chance to tell my own version. My father told family friends that I had run off and ruined my life, with a man who would never amount to anything. My mother told her church group that I had been led astray, and that they were heartbroken. The version of events they shared made me sound reckless and ungrateful, and Daniel sound like someone who had stolen me away from a good life. Within weeks, the effects rippled outward. Cousins stopped responding to my messages. A family friend I had known since childhood unfollowed me without explanation. Invitations to gatherings I had attended my whole life stopped arriving. I wasn't just cut out of the family. I was edited out of the story entirely and replaced with a version of me that my parents had written themselves. It was the cruelty of it that surprised me most. I had expected them to be angry. I had even expected silence. But the deliberate campaign to control how I was seen by everyone we knew felt like something else entirely. It told me this wasn't grief. This was revenge. A few months after the wedding, a cousin I still had contact with sent me a screenshot without any explanation attached. It was a photo my mother had posted on social media. In it, my sister Fiona was standing in what used to be my childhood bedroom, smiling in a new dress my mother had clearly bought for her. The caption read, "So proud of my girl." I stared at the screen for a long time. Fiona had always lived in my shadow growing up, not because I pushed her there, but because my parents placed more pressure on me as the older daughter. She used to complain about that sometimes, quietly, when we were alone. I thought we understood each other. But she had stepped into the role the moment it became available. She began hosting family dinners. She appeared in the social posts where I used to be. She started going on the trips with my parents that we had always taken as a family. My mother tagged her in photographs with words that used to be saved for me. I didn't blame Fiona entirely. She had been shaped by the same parents I had. But watching her replace me so quickly still hurt in a way I hadn't expected. It made the loss feel more final. I expected Daniel to crack under the weight of everything. How could he not? He had married me knowing my family hated him, and then watched as everything fell apart because of it. He had taken on the financial pressure of keeping us afloat while I was still too heartbroken to function properly. Any reasonable person might have started to feel resentment. He never did. He worked longer hours without complaint. He came home tired and still made dinner and sat with me and asked how I was feeling. When I cried, he didn't tell me to stop or remind me that I had made my choice. He just stayed. One evening I told him I was sorry, that I had brought all of this into his life and I didn't know how to fix it. He looked at me for a moment, then said, "Naomi, I didn't marry your family. I married you. And you are not a problem I need to fix." I had spent my whole life with people who placed conditions on their love. People who would withdraw warmth the moment I stepped out of line. Daniel had never once made me feel that way. He wasn't perfect, but he was consistent. And after everything I had been through, consistency felt like the most generous thing a person could offer. About a year after the wedding, I found out I was pregnant. Daniel and I sat on the edge of the bathtub together after reading the test, and he held my hand and said we were going to be great parents. I believed him. But there was a quiet ache underneath the happiness that I couldn't shake. I wanted my mother. I know that probably sounds strange after everything she had done. But pregnancy has a way of making you want the people who were supposed to love you most. I picked up the phone one evening and called her number. It rang 3 times and then she answered. I told her I was pregnant. My voice cracked a little when I said it, because some part of me was still hoping that this news would be the thing that finally softened her. She listened without saying a word. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You made your choice, Naomi." Her voice was flat and steady, as if I had called to tell her about the weather. And then she hung up. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time after that. Not crying. Just sitting. Something had broken open inside me and gone cold, and I think that was the moment I finally stopped hoping. Labor started at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. I had read every book, watched every video, and prepared as much as any first-time mother could. But nothing quite prepares you for the moment you are lying in a hospital bed, exhausted and frightened, and you realize that the people who should be there simply are not. No mother squeezing my hand and telling me what to expect. No sister pacing the hallway outside. No grandmother praying in the waiting room. Just Daniel sitting beside me. His face tight with worry he was trying to hide for my sake. The nurses were kind. One of them, an older woman with short hair and a steady voice, kept checking in on me more often than she needed to. I think she could see it on my face. The kind of loneliness that doesn't disappear just because the room is full of people. When our son was finally born and they placed him in my arms, I felt something shift inside my chest. He was small and red and perfect, and he looked up at me with dark, unfocused eyes. Daniel leaned over and put his forehead against mine. In that moment, I was overwhelmed with love. But I also made a quiet, certain decision. This child would always know he was wanted. The first months after our son Theo was born were the hardest of my life. Not because of the sleepless nights or the constant worry or the way time seemed to disappear into a blur of feeding and soothing and keeping a tiny person alive. It was hard because we were doing all of it on the edge of what our finances allowed. Daniel worked construction jobs during the day. I started taking on freelance bookkeeping work from home, logging numbers on a laptop while Theo slept on my chest. We worked opposite shifts when we could, handing Theo off at the door like a relay baton, exchanging tired smiles and quick updates before one of us went in and the other went out. There were nights I moved money between accounts just to make sure the rent cleared. There were weeks we chose which bill to delay so we could buy groceries. I never told my parents any of this, not that they would have asked. But something else was also happening during those hard months. Something slow and quiet. I was learning that I was stronger than I had ever been allowed to believe. Every bill I managed, every problem I solved, every morning I got up and kept going, it was proof. I didn't need saving. I just needed time. The first sign that things might actually change came 18 months after Theo was born. Daniel had been picking up side jobs on weekends for extra money. Fixing decks, patching roofs, replacing old plumbing. He was good with his hands and reliable, and word traveled the way it does in neighborhoods where people talk to each other. One Saturday, a homeowner asked if he had a business card. Daniel didn't. But he came home that evening and said, "I think I should start something of my own." We sat at the kitchen table after Theo was asleep and talked through the numbers. It was tight. The startup costs were real and the risk was real. But Daniel had built a small reputation for quality work, and I knew how to manage the financial side of things. We registered the business with what we had saved and called it Hartwell Home Repairs, using Daniel's mother's family name. The first few months were slow. Jobs trickled in rather than flooded. But they came, and each one paid better than the construction work Daniel had been doing for someone else. For the first time, we weren't just surviving each month. We were beginning, slowly, carefully, to build something. It was small, but it was ours. A distant cousin named Petra was the one who told me what my parents said when they heard about the business. Petra had stayed in quiet contact with me throughout the years, sending occasional messages to check in. She wasn't close to my parents, which made her someone I trusted. One afternoon she texted me, "Your dad heard about Daniel's business. He said, and I quote, 'He'll fail like everyone else in his family. Thought you should know.'" I read the message twice. Then I put my phone down and walked to the window. Something had changed in me over the years. When I first left my family, their words could tear something open inside me for days. But standing at that window, reading my father's casual cruelty delivered secondhand through a cousin's text, I felt something different. I didn't feel hurt. Felt fuel. There is a particular kind of anger that doesn't make you loud or reckless. It makes you quiet and focused and very, very determined. I had carried years of grief for the family I lost. I had spent too long wondering if they were right about me. My father's words were the last time I wondered. I stopped wanting their love that afternoon. I started wanting something better. Proof so undeniable it could never be argued away. 4 years passed. Theo started walking and then running and then asking questions about everything he could see. Daniel's business grew from weekend side jobs to a full operation with 3 employees and a waiting list of clients. I managed the books, handled client communication, and eventually ran the business finances full-time. We moved out of the apartment above the laundromat and into a rented house in a quiet neighborhood with a yard. A year after that, we bought the house. It wasn't a mansion. It was a 3-bedroom home on a tree-lined street with a porch that needed repainting and a garden I had no idea how to maintain. But my name was on the deed. There were still hard months. Business ownership is never perfectly smooth. But the difference between struggling and building is that building leaves something behind. We had credit now. We had savings. We had a son who knew he was loved without conditions. I thought about my parents sometimes, but differently than I used to. Not with longing. More the way you think about a storm that passed, aware of the damage it left but grateful you made it through. We hadn't just survived what they did to us. We had quietly, stubbornly, turned it into something they never expected. It started with a reporter from a small local business magazine who reached out through our company's email. She was writing a piece about entrepreneurs who had started with very little and built steadily from the ground up. Someone had recommended Hartwell Home Repairs, and she wanted to know if Daniel and I would be willing to talk. We agreed. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time. The interview took place at our kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Theo played in the yard. The reporter was warm and thorough, asking about the early days, the struggles, how we had made decisions, what we had learned. I answered honestly because I had nothing to hide and nothing to perform. The article ran 6 weeks later. There was a photograph of Daniel and me standing in front of our house, smiling. The headline called us a quiet success story built from scratch. I shared it on our business page and didn't think much more about it. But someone sent it to my parents. I didn't know that right away. I found out later through Petra that my father had seen the article and gone very quiet. My mother had apparently read it twice. I had been invisible to them for years. Suddenly I was not. My mother called on a Thursday evening, 8 days after the article was published. I was washing dishes when my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. I had never deleted her contact. I had thought about it many times, but I never did. Maybe some part of me knew this call would come eventually. I dried my hands and answered. "Naomi," she said. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind of tone you use when you want someone to relax their guard. "It's Mom. We miss you. We've been thinking about you. We miss you." 4 years of silence. No phone call during my pregnancy. No visit when Theo was born. No birthday cards. Nothing. And what she offered was "we miss you." I stood at the kitchen counter and waited for whatever came next. I didn't say much. I gave short answers and let the silence stretch when it needed to. She said they would love to see me. She said it had been too long. She did not apologize. She did not mention the wedding. She did not ask about Theo by name, even though she had to know by now that we had a child. I told her I would think about it. I hung up and sat down slowly. 2 weeks later, my parents appeared at our front door on a Sunday afternoon with shopping bags and wide smiles, as if 4 years of silence could be folded up and put away like old laundry. My mother had brought gifts. A toy for Theo, clearly expensive, wrapped in neat paper with a ribbon. A bottle of wine for Daniel and me. She hugged me on the doorstep and said, "You look wonderful, sweetheart." My father shook Daniel's hand and told him the house was lovely. I let them in. I still don't know exactly why. Curiosity, maybe. Or the stubborn part of me that needed to see what they had become. They praised everything. The home, the garden, the way Theo spoke in full sentences at 4 years old. They called Daniel a real hard worker, which from my father I understood was as close to a compliment as he knew how to give. For a short time, sitting around the dining table with tea and biscuits, it almost felt normal. But I had grown up in that family. I knew the difference between warmth and performance. And I had learned, in the years since the wedding, to trust what I observed rather than what I was told. Something was off. I just hadn't found it yet. It happened during dinner. We were halfway through the meal when my father set down his fork and said, almost casually, "So how is the business actually doing? Turnover-wise, I mean. Are you turning a proper profit?" I looked at him. He kept going. He asked how many employees we had, what our overhead looked like, whether we had invested the profits or left them in the business account. He asked about the house, whether we had a fixed mortgage or a variable one, how much equity we had built up, whether we had any other assets. He framed every question as interest, as a father catching up. But my father had never been casually interested in anyone's finances unless he was calculating something. I had watched him do it my whole life at family gatherings, the way he quietly sized up what people had and what they were worth to him. Daniel caught my eye across the table, just for a second, but I could see he had noticed it too. I answered everything vaguely. I smiled and redirected and said things like, "We're comfortable, thank you." My mother jumped in with pleasant conversation whenever the silence stretched too long. By the time we cleared the plates, I was certain. This visit was not about love. It was about information. Fiona called me 3 days later. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She sounded different. Quieter than I remembered, with a tiredness in her voice that hadn't been there when we were younger. She asked how I was. I told her I was fine. Then she asked if our parents had visited, and when I said yes, she went quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to know I'm not calling because they asked me to. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know what's really going on." She told me everything. My father's company, which had looked solid for years, had been quietly struggling for almost 2 years. He had made some bad decisions and some worse investments, and the losses had piled up in ways he'd kept hidden from most of the family. My mother had maxed out 2 credit cards trying to cover things without telling him. The house they had lived in my whole childhood was now dangerously close to foreclosure. The boat they bought when I was 12. The annual international trips. The lifestyle they had maintained as proof of their superiority. All of it had been built on ground that had been crumbling for longer than anyone knew. Fiona's voice cracked a little at the end. They need money, Naomi. That's why they came. They called 4 days after Fiona's warning. My father asked if he and my mother could come by again. I said yes because I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I wanted to sit across from them and let them say it out loud. They arrived on a Tuesday evening and sat in the same chairs they had occupied the week before. My mother's hands were folded in her lap. My father cleared his throat twice before he started speaking. He talked about family first. About how blood was thicker than disagreements. About how they had made mistakes but were still my parents and that counted for something. He talked for nearly 5 minutes before he finally got to the point. They needed a loan. A significant one. Enough to cover the debt on the house and stabilize things until my father could restructure the business. He named a number that took my breath away. He said it so calmly. As if 4 years of abandonment were simply a rough patch we could fold neatly into the past now that they needed something from me. My mother looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "We have nowhere else to turn, Naomi," she whispered. I sat very still. I looked at the people who had walked out of my wedding, and I said nothing for a long time. Within a week of my refusal, my phone began filling up with messages from relatives I had barely spoken to in years. An aunt I hadn't seen since before the wedding sent me a long message about the importance of family forgiveness. A cousin wrote to say I was letting pride destroy something irreplaceable. My father's older brother, who had stood up and walked out of my wedding without looking at me, sent a voice note explaining that my parents had sacrificed so much and the least I could do was help in their time of need. Not one of them mentioned the wedding. Not one of them acknowledged what had been done to me. My parents had clearly spent the days since my refusal making phone calls, shaping the story the way they always had. In their version, I had become wealthy and heartless and was punishing my elderly parents out of spite. They left out the part where they abandoned me at the altar. They left out the frozen bank accounts, the returned photographs, and the phone call where my mother said, "You made your choice," while I was pregnant and frightened. They were very good at leaving things out. I read each message once, then placed my phone face down and went to watch Theo play in the garden. I didn't reply to a single one. The family gathering happened 6 weeks later. It was my grandmother on my mother's side. Her 78th birthday. She was one of the few people in the family I still had any warmth for. And when Petra told me she had specifically asked if I would come, I decided to go. I did not expect my parents to try anything there. I should have known better. About an hour into the evening, my father positioned himself near the center of the room with a glass in his hand and began speaking loudly about loyalty, about family, about how people reveal themselves in hard times. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Every person in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. I put down my glass and stood up. "I'd like to say something," I said. The room went quiet. I spoke clearly and without raising my voice. I told them about the ultimatum delivered 3 months before my wedding. I described the morning my bank account was frozen. I told them about the photographs returned in a padded envelope. I told them about the phone call when I was pregnant, about going into labor without my mother, about 4 years of complete and deliberate silence. Then I told them about the dinner where my father carefully asked about our assets. And then I stopped and let it all sit in the air where everyone could see it clearly. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after I stopped speaking. My mother stood up and her eyes were full of tears. She said they had made mistakes. She said they were sorry. She said that losing me had changed them and they just wanted their daughter back. Her voice broke on the last word. My father looked older than I had ever seen him. The confidence that had always made rooms shrink around him seemed to have drained out somewhere in the past few years. He asked me not to let pride destroy what was left of the family. He said they were losing everything and they needed me. He wasn't wrong about that last part. But I sat very still and I thought about the pastor asking if we wanted to continue. I thought about Daniel's hand holding mine. I thought about the apartment above the laundromat, and the kitchen floor where I sat after my mother said, "You made your choice," and Theo's face the moment he was placed in my arms. I thought about every month Daniel and I had kept going when we had every reason to stop. I thought about all of it. Then I looked at my parents. No, I said quietly. My mother's tears spilled over. My father stared at me like he couldn't believe it. I had nothing more to add. I walked out of that gathering the same way my family had walked out of my wedding. Steadily, without looking back, while people watched in silence. But I was not doing it out of cruelty. I was doing it out of something it had taken me a long time to learn. The knowledge that I was allowed to protect myself. That protecting myself was not the same as being heartless. That saying no to people who had deeply harmed me was not a crime simply because we shared a last name. Daniel was in the kitchen when I got home, helping Theo finish a puzzle on the living room floor. Theo ran to me the moment I came through the door, wrapping himself around my legs the way small children do when they love you without conditions or calculations. I picked him up and held him close. Later that night, after he was asleep, Daniel asked me how it had gone. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had, the way he had been doing since the very beginning. When I finished, he simply said, "Are you okay?" I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said. "I think I finally am." My parents lost the daughter they had tried to own. I gained the life they swore I never could. The peace I found that night was mine, and no one would ever take it from me again.